Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin in a few moments. So if you would please start making your way to your seats. Thank you very much. Once again, we're going to begin in a few minutes, so please make your way to your seats. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin in a few minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin in 1 minute. If you would please take your seats. 1 minute. Thank you.
threat of terrorism has no borders and affects many facets of society, both domestically and globally.
With a deadly ambush carefully planned.
It was one of the worst attacks against Spanish civilians.
The worst terrorist attack in Britain.
A bomb which killed 52 people.
After mysterious fumes of poison gas.
I heard from my car a very loud big bomb. Come down the steps.
It was just horrible. I used to get out.
Terrorism impacts every ideology, nationality, and religion. The lives of people throughout the United States and around the world are equally affected by terrorism. The Center for Empowered Living and Learning is a non-profit, non-partisan institution dedicated to addressing the most salient issue of our time, terrorism. The CEL's exhibit, Anyone, Anytime, Anywhere, Understanding the Threat of Terrorism, provides a comprehensive look at the challenges that civilized societies face, offering educational opportunities and experiences that help audiences explore their own beliefs and values, empowering them to proactively affect change.
Terrorists don't share a common ideology. What terrorists do share is a common mindset.
Many terrorists, be they international or domestic, they're looking for a target of opportunity to make the biggest statement they can make.
Throughout the exhibit, the visitor learns about the history of terrorism and its global reach. The CEL explores the evolution of terrorism and how it has been influenced by technological advances and ideological shifts. Learn how terrorism directly affects children and how terrorist organizations produce and manipulate media to spread their message, recruit members, incite violence, and plan attacks.
This terrorism isn't our fault. We didn't cause it. It is an attack on our way of life.
Hear the voices from around the world that are speaking out against terrorism and about the tools that are available to you to combat it.
It doesn't take courage to shoot a policeman in the back of the head.
No one is looking into the problem of extremism, the problem of terrorism.
Aquí tenemos que mantener toda esta masa crítica de seguridad.
We need to cooperate with authorities. We need to help the authorities.
The responsibility is on our shoulders big.
We will come through this.
The exhibit resides in a state-of-the-art multimedia facility located in Denver's Daniel Libeskind-designed Civic Center Cultural Complex. We invite you to visit the CEL and experience anyone, anytime, anywhere for yourself.
Terror is not a new weapon. Throughout history, it has been used by those who could not prevail, either by persuasion or example. But inevitably, they fail.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Courtney Meisel, founding director of the CEL, and Melanie Perlman, executive director of the CEL.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the kickoff of Denver's 2010 Homeland Security Conference. The Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, the CEL, is excited to host tonight's program with the Denver Urban Area Security Initiative and Mayor and now Governor-elect John Hickenlooper. The UASC Shared Strategies Conference, taking place over the next 3 days, brings together law enforcement, first responders, healthcare professionals, and the business community from across our state, across the nation, and across the globe to study best practices on prevention, preparedness, and response. To that end, I want to recognize the vision and leadership of Governor Ritter, Mayor Hickenlooper, the UASC Executive Board and team led by Dan Alexander, Director of Denver's Office of Emergency Management, and Captain Jennifer Steck, in putting together a conference of this caliber. I also want to welcome and thank the many dignitaries and thought leaders from Israel and across the U.S. We applaud your commitment to keeping our community safe. The CEL is excited to participate in tonight's program as it falls directly in line with our vision.
As you know, terrorism is an increasingly dangerous threat, not just to Americans, but to all civil societies, which value human life and support fundamental democratic principles. The greatest test of the 21st century will be defined by the ability of nations and individuals to work collectively to confront the security challenges that continue to affect our way of life. The cell has established itself as a center dedicated to help combat the threat of terrorism. Its programming series and training initiatives, developed in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security and community preparedness groups, have received national media attention, but more importantly, they have educated thousands of individuals. The reason for our accomplishments is quite simply because we have the honor of working with all of you collectively. You demonstrate the cell's diverse partnerships between government, academic, private, and civic organizations that are committed to our community safety. This evening's program is yet another great example of this collaborative effort, and I would like to recognize tonight's sponsors: AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the Allied Jewish Federation of Colorado, the Colorado Emergency Preparedness Partnership, the Denver Art Museum, our feature sponsor, the Denver Post, Fastlane Productions, and Red Cross Mile High Chapter. I would also like to recognize a number of individuals who were instrumental in really putting tonight's program together, and that is the cell's staff. Christina Gradias, who is my deputy. Christina has been instrumental in helping plan all the logistics, but also interfacing with UASI, so I really wanted to take a moment to applaud her efforts. And I also want to recognize the rest of my staff: Kristen, Karen, Doug, and Suzanne, as well as Laura Teal, Larry Meisel's executive assistant, who've really been instrumental in planning tonight's event. Thank you all. Now it is my privilege to turn it over to Dan Alexander, Director of Denver's Office of Emergency Management. Dan.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Courtney. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's a great honor to open up this conference in this venue with the partnership of the Cell. When we started down this road of planning this conference, which seems like an eternity ago, we were so fortunate to have the relationships that we have here in the Denver metropolitan area, and to have the organizations such as the Cell located right in our backyard that shares the vision that we have of making our community safer, empowering our public safety and private citizens to recognize our threats, our transnational threats, and empowering those to take action. And the Cell has been a great partner in doing that for us and that provide that programming. And it was a natural fit for this conference to kick off, if you will, this evening in this great venue with this great program. I would also like to acknowledge for the UASI conference the Shared Strategies for Homeland Security that will be taking place over the next 3 days at the Sheraton Hotel. Would not be made possible as well by our other major sponsors, including the Anschutz Foundation, the Antero Charitable Foundation, the Denver Police Foundation, ESRI, Microsoft, and the Target Foundation. Without the support of those sponsors, this conference, again, would not have been possible. You know, as the Director of Emergency Management and Homeland Security for the City and County of Denver and the chairperson of the Denver Urban Area Security Initiative, we have to interact on a regional and state level. The way in which we have been effectively been able to accomplish our goals is for the governor and his Office of Homeland Security to provide the environment for this type of collaboration and cooperation. As a former district attorney, Governor Ritter has a profound understanding of the security issues that we face locally, regionally, nationally, and even internationally. In fact, Governor Ritter has fostered important transnational cooperation for Colorado. This summer, he spent a week in Israel developing partnerships and agreements across numerous sectors, including water, biotech, agriculture, and security. And we're very proud that the Shared Strategies for Homeland Security Conference is another example of that transnational cooperation. And this conference demonstrates that strength and importance of partnerships. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce the leader of our state, Governor Bill Ritter.
Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. It's a great crowd here tonight. I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege because I suspect it'll be the last time that I'll speak at a CEL event while I'm governor of the state. And I would just say to all those that have been involved in the formation of the CEL, it really is a dramatic contribution, not just to the Denver community or the Colorado community, but to the country. It was mentioned before, this is one of a kind, the CEL is, in terms of just an educational opportunity for the people of this state and people who travel here to understand and develop a deeper understanding of terrorism. And I know there are a lot of people that have been involved in it. Certainly Larry Meisel sort of is the chief founder and sponsor of this. And to both of you, Melanie and Courtney, thank you for all the work that you do with the CEL and the opportunities you've availed over the past couple of years to ensure that we do our level best in educating people. I was with Janet Napolitano as she toured the CEL and was really, I think she was overwhelmed by the kinds of things that are happening here and thankful that there are people that care enough about our fight against terrorism that you would put something like this together. So it's been an honor as governor to be able to partner with you in so many ways, and I can speak for our folks in Homeland Security, both General Mason and then Chief Trujillo after him, as the partnership that we've had and we've been able to form has done very good things, both on the nonprofit side and on the state side. I did form, after becoming governor, a governor's office of Homeland Security. We did Homeland Security. In many respects, we did it pretty well, but we felt it was important to concentrate it into one office. And the reason for that just has to do with how important the work of Office of Homeland Security is. Much of what we're able to do has to do with federal funding that flows to state government. And our opportunities to look at ways to fund the Urban Area Security Initiative has helped me understand the level at which we can all be involved in this fight against terrorism. I think because my roots professionally were in the district attorney's office, I understand local law enforcement and sort of the ways that they intersect with people who would do us harm. And certainly if you think about so many of the different terrorism threats and even terrorism incidents that we've experienced in our recent history over the last 2 decades, local law enforcement has been very involved in either stopping those or, if they occur, in investigating those and being the first responders. And that's why this is such a fantastic event for us to be able to host here in Colorado. This ability to talk about security and talk about the first responders and really learn from international experts about preventing terrorism and doing it from the perspective of police, or in our case, police, fire, EMTs, and our National Guard. I want to just take a moment, and again, another moment of personal privilege, for me to be able to acknowledge all the people in this room who have made a professional commitment to this. Whether you're in law enforcement or a person who is otherwise a first responder, firefighters, EMTs, all of the people who may show up at a scene, or our Colorado National Guard, I'd just like for the rest of us to give you a round of applause for your willingness to serve. As Dan alluded, a group of Coloradans took a trip this summer to Israel. We were there in July for a week, sponsored by the Allied Jewish Federation. It was an economic development trip, but while we were there, we certainly discussed security issues with Israelis. We were in Tel Aviv, but then we went to an area that bordered the Gaza Strip, and I was able to see this place that we all hear so much about and just realize what a small geographical area has caused so much disturbance internationally for so long. We went down onto the Egyptian border and were there and visited about security issues even across the border. We went up into Jerusalem. We spent a lot of time in the Negev desert. We were talking about agriculture and water issues, energy issues certainly. Went up to Jerusalem, spent a fair amount of time in Jerusalem speaking with ministers, Israeli ministers, but as well developing our own sense about what a complicated situation it was and is. We went to the Sea of Galilee and spent time on the Sea of Galilee and took a trip kind of along the wall, both up and back, and really came away, I think, as intrigued in a sort of serious and somber way by the situation in the Middle East as anything I've ever experienced. I often tell people I think about it every day. our trip to Israel because of how complicated it is and really how layered so many parts of it are. You cannot understand any sector, the economic sector, the political sector, the religious sector, the security sector, without understanding kind of all sectors together and the many crosscuts that occur when trying to think about them. If you try and understand any sector alone, you will disparage the whole. You really have to try and think about it as an entire situation. Security is just one facet of that, but it's obviously a very important facet. And that's why it's important to have Israelis here, to have them share with us their experiences regarding their own terrorism issues and the opportunities that they've availed themselves to prevent terrorism, to investigate terrorism, and talk to us about how we do our level best at securing our borders, but securing the heartland as well. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who knows a great deal about the topic as well. He's Honorable Juan Zarate. Mr. Zarate is currently the Senior Advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and is the Senior National Security Analyst for CBS. From 2005 to 2009, Mr. Zarate served as the Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States and as the Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. In these roles, he was responsible for developing and overseeing the effective implementation of the United States government's counterterrorism strategy. Prior to joining the NSC, Mr. Zarate served as the first assistant to the Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, where he led Treasury's domestic and international efforts to dismantle terrorist financing. Mr. Zarate also served as a prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Terrorism and Violent Crime Section, where he worked on terrorism cases, including the USS Cole investigation. Please help me now welcome the Honorable Juan Zarate.
Governor Ritter, thank you for that kind introduction. I need to thank all of you for the warm introduction and welcome earlier. I actually feel, now that this is my second trip to Denver, that I'm a part of this community in an adopted way, so I want to thank you all. Let me thank the sponsors of this event, and in particular the CEL, Melanie, Courtney, an incredible organization. I think much has been said about it, but I don't think it's fully appreciated, especially outside of Denver. I don't think folks in Washington truly appreciate what you've built out here, and I want to thank you. I want to thank the governor-elect for his remarks earlier, and I want to thank and welcome the Israeli delegation, distinguished delegation, from whom not only we will learn a lot, but hopefully get to compart and share information throughout the conference. Finally, let me commend those who are part of the Urban Area Security Initiative, both those who are programmatically involved. I met a few of you during the reception. Those who are learning about it for the first time. I think it is both an example of how state and local communities can take ownership over security issues at home. And so let me commend you all for a wonderful conference and the right actors brought together. And Dan, let me thank you as well and the city of Denver, because I think Denver in some ways provides an example for how local communities and municipalities really can empower their citizenry to take ownership over these issues, to not feel powerless in the face of the threats that we face in the 21st century. Let me, with the few moments that I have with you, talk a little bit about at least my impressions of how we need to be rethinking what Homeland Security means in the 21st century. Not only in the face of changing threats that we read about in the paper and that we know about well, but also in terms of the need to create new forms of cooperation, new forms of collaboration to deal with these threats, and understanding that clearly in the environment that we face, not only domestically but internationally, with the U.S. challenged from non-state actors and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, but also challenged geopolitically from countries like China, Iran, and others. So what I'd like to do is frame for you, at least from my perspective, how we should be thinking about Homeland Security in the 21st century. And some of this will reflect lessons that I've learned from the Israelis and others when I was both at the Treasury Department and at the White House. We worked very closely together, for example, on trying to undercut the legitimacy of Hamas, stop financing to Hamas, see its designation by the European Union as a terrorist organization, as well as to work on stopping the flows and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction around the world. And so I'm quite proud of the work we did together and proud of the work that is yet to come, I think. But let me start by mapping out how I see this new threat environment, which I think is important to understand if we are to respond appropriately to the homeland and national security threats of the 21st century. And I'd like to think of this in ways that I think are appropriate, especially for those who are part of the first responder community here and the local law enforcement, and certainly from our Israeli delegation standpoint. And that is that the local is global and the global is local. That is to say, the 21st century is really becoming a borderless world in many ways, where the threats that we see abroad are threats that can materialize in ways at home that we before would never have imagined. We're in an age of globalization where the world is interconnected in ways that we've never seen before, the age of the internet where information flows seamlessly across borders, an age where the movement of goods and people and ideas grows more and more seamless over time. It's also an environment in which the U.S. is not only seen as the leader in this world, this globalization, but the U.S. in many ways is heavily reliant on it in the sense of relying on international supply chains, energy resources, finances, and of course we know the digital infrastructure, the internet that the United States is heavily reliant on. This is a world in which rapid innovation is happening every second, where the developing world is taking evolutionary leaps forward. For example, 3/4 of the 4 billion cell phone users in the world now reside in the developing world. Of the new users of the internet, 226 million last year, 72% come from the developing world. A favorite image of mine that I've seen over and over described is of the Maasai warrior, the traditional warrior in Kenya, with the traditional garb, with the spear in one hand and the cell phone in the other, tracking the tour buses and also then the transfers of money via cell phone. That, in many ways, is the 21st century, where the local is global and the global is local. And this is a fluid, borderless environment, all to the good in many ways, commercially, technologically, in terms of information flow. But it also presents new risks in terms of the threats that emerge in that environment. And I think in some ways it's seen best in terms of the terrorist threat that we see coming to us from Al-Qaeda. And let me describe to you how I see that threat evolving. I sometimes call this the Al-Qaeda Hydra, or the multiple heads to this beast, because in some ways I think we're facing a more complicated threat from Al-Qaeda and related groups than ever before. I just hosted at CSIS in Washington, D.C., the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, a very good friend of mine, Mike Leiter, with whom I've worked for many years. And he said publicly that this is the most intense and complicated period of threats that the United States government has faced since 9/11. And it's in part because of this Hydra. You still have the Al-Qaeda core. This is the bin Ladens, the Zawahiris, the traditional Al-Qaeda that we've thought about that perpetrated 9/11, still in existence, weakened, less able to operate globally, but still there. They are behind, for example, the threat to Europe that we've all heard about. We heard about the threat advisories for travel to Europe. That is a threat directly coming out of Pakistan from the Al-Qaeda core. We then have the Al-Qaeda affiliates, groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, this group in Yemen that has now formed and grown more and more stronger. They are behind the Abdul Muttalib failed December 25th attack. They were behind the recent package plots. And in many ways, these regional groups that are like-minded and affiliated with Al-Qaeda are growing minds of their own, trying to attack the United States and the West in any way they can. And finally, and perhaps the most complicated of the heads of this Hydra, are the self-starters, those individuals who may not be directly trained by Al-Qaeda, may not be official affiliates, but who grow radicalized, who fall prey to the allure of the narrative of Al-Qaeda, the ideology that says the West is at war with Islam, it's a Muslim's duty to fight that onslaught from the West, And Al-Qaeda and its ideology are the vanguard of that narrative. And so there are individuals, and unfortunately now we're seeing more and more Americans falling prey to the ideology. And so these are self-starters, individuals who form part of a growing threat. And it's in this environment where you have a blending of the groups, a blending of motivations, an autonomy growing with these groups, for example, out of Yemen or Somalia or North Africa, and where these groups are growing more savvy in terms of their strategic approach. In some ways, trying to bleed the United States of blood and treasure. In some ways, trying to bait the United States into acting where we would not otherwise want to act. And subscribing to a new strategy that we've seen, for example, coming out of Yemen, directed, I think, by the American Yemeni cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, where they are satisfied with terrorizing through disruption versus plain destruction. Whereas Al-Qaeda's model for many years had been achieve the maximum destructive impact, now you have groups trying to simply disrupt and terrorize our commercial activity, our day-to-day activity. And again, you add to that the homegrown threats that we've seen, most recently in Portland, saw the case in Maryland, the DC Metro plot disrupted in our nation's capital, in Dallas, in Springfield, Illinois. We can go on. Unfortunately, it's a much more blended, diverse, and complicated threat. But this new environment obviously offers challenges, but I think it offers opportunities as well. And it requires new thinking as to how we think about and how we achieve security, both as a community and as a nation. We have traditionally thought of Homeland Security as prevention, response, resilience. We have built, especially since 9/11, I think quite well, a Homeland Security model that attempts to keep dangerous people and goods from our borders, with, in the first instance, pushing our borders out, trying to build systems, cooperative relationships, external technologies, for example, screening technologies, that literally push our borders out before individuals or goods hit our borders. We've also, much like the Israelis, built layers of defense, understanding that no single layer can be foolproof. And so whether it's better information gathering, better screening, better security at the ports, better internal security, there are layers that are built into that homeland system. But all of this is built and predicated on the notion of the enemy coming from the outside. And in some ways, we're faced with a critical threat here in a borderless world where the threat not only comes from the outside, but from perhaps within. And where the movements, whether they be terrorism or otherwise, are fluid, and our interests are global. And so in that context, we need to think about what security means. In the first instance, I think this means needing to form new alliances and collaboration. Internationally, without a doubt, and I think our bilateral relationships with the Israelis is a very good example of how to do it on a state-to-state basis. But I think it's more than that. I think it's creating coalitions of like-minded countries coming together to solve some of the problems that vex the entire world, whether it's proliferation or pandemics. That involves sharing information, building best practices, exercising how we respond to events, sharing burdens of how we actually build those layers of defense for all of us. Again, we've seen this around the world in numerous places, not just in U.S.-Israeli relations, but also in places like Southeast Asia, where the cooperative relations between Australia, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the United States and the Philippines has actually increased the counterterrorism defenses of the region. Many people back in 2001 would have said Southeast Asia is the second front in the war on terror. If you're going to see an expansion in the war from South Asia, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, it will be Southeast Asia. It's now almost off the map, so to speak, from a security perspective, in part because you've had important collaboration and work by the countries most interested. There are other examples. For example, you have Mexico and Colombia now working and collaborating on the drug cartel problem that so vexes our Mexican neighbors to the south. In addition, I think Collaboration has to put state and local authorities at the center, not the periphery, but at the center of official response. And so it's the work of officials who are sitting amongst us that actually has to be viewed as the centerpiece of our homeland security and not just as an ancillary part of what the federal government may decide to fund year in, year out. Denver is a good example of this. NYPD, where I just was with Commissioner Kelly a few days ago, a phenomenal example of this. And this is also, and again, a credit to what's happening here today, not just state and local governments working with the U.S. federal government, but working with other state and local municipalities, working with other experts around the world. I know, for example, the NYPD has worked very closely with the Spaniards, for example, to look to see how they have dealt with the response to the Madrid bombings in 2005. And then finally, that collaboration actually has to center on a new sense of social responsibility. And I love what the CEL stands for, the Center for Empowered Living and Learning. I mean, it's really about putting citizenry in the center of our sense of security, putting social responsibility in the hands of community leaders, community groups, and citizens. And it's not a matter of people being scared. In fact, the terrorists win if we're collectively scared. But it's about being aware. It's not about all of us being security obsessed. I remember President Bush often telling me, it's our job to worry about the worst nightmare scenario so that our fellow citizens don't have to. But it's about individuals and communities feeling empowered. And importantly, I think it's about using and leveraging the strength of the private sector. Individuals, for example, to prevent terrorist attacks, where the Department of Homeland Security has said that almost 1/3 of terrorist plots disrupted over the last decade have been the result of citizen tips and information. From communities, where, for example, Muslim American communities have now come out with reports suggesting that the vast majority of tips about problematic individuals in Muslim American communities has come from the communities themselves. From companies and organizations, where, for example, in the wake of Katrina, it was clear that some of the best capacities to respond to the worst areas affected came from the Walmarts of the world, those who knew how to distribute goods, who had infrastructure, and who understood their communities. There's been good progress on some of this. There are organizations, not just the Urban Area Security Initiative, but also organizations and initiatives like CTPAT that tries to incorporate companies into the Homeland Security paradigm. But this is all about being less than top-down. It's about being ground up, because the local is global. And it puts the citizen at the center. It empowers the citizen. It creates a sense of social responsibility, as we see in Israel. And it's bottom up, not just top down. And again, I think we have much to learn from the Israelis in this context, and I would encourage you to speak to them, because I think embedded in the sense of national and homeland security in Israel is a sense of citizen empowerment and citizen and social resilience. And so not only do you have citizens who are taught at a young age as to how to respond with readiness awareness campaigns, not only do you have citizen volunteer corps who are part of emergency management, blood distribution centers, and the like, but you have a clear sense that strategically society has to respond aggressively to the attacks that occur and needs to be resilient so the terrorists don't win every time there's a successful attack. There's much to learn from that lesson. Now, let me talk a little bit about all of this in the context of the challenges the United States faces directly. And unfortunately, I'm a Southern Californian. That's not the unfortunate part. The unfortunate part is I live in Washington, D.C. But it's in that environment where you feel and see, it's almost palpable, the angst that people have surrounding this debate about America's decline. The inevitability of America's decline in the face of our fiscal challenges, in the face of challenges abroad, the rise of China, India, Brazil as major economic powers, the continued threats from a security perspective from not only Al-Qaeda, but countries like Iran and North Korea. And it's an important debate, an important question, but in some ways I worry about a self-fulfilling prophecy. and a sense of vulnerability that grows every time we repeat the angst of our imminent decline. But there is a question of American leadership out there. That is real, from economic issues to security issues. There are realities of resource constraints. I think officials here who deal with Homeland Security grants can speak to that and the angst that that creates, whether or not your programs will be funded in the out years. And it's also a reality that we can't afford to continue to be the world's policeman and fireman at the same time while underwriting the security of the world. And it's also in that environment where we have multiple actors targeting the United States, trying to take full advantage of this sense of vulnerability and weakness. We have not only terrorist groups, but what I call alliances of rogue actors. If WikiLeaks has done anything, I think it has revealed some of these alliances in the public scope, such as the relationship between Iran and North Korea, or Syria and North Korea, or Venezuela and Iran. And the reality that these are alliances not so much formed by ideological alliance, but formed by an opposition to U.S. interests abroad. But the reality is we are still the superpower, viewed as such, viewed in many ways by terrorists and others alike as a symbol of modernity and of globalization, the head of the snake, as Al-Qaeda often likes to refer to us. And we are often the target not only of state actors or terrorist groups, but of folks like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, who clearly have ulterior motives in mind with respect to U.S. interests. And so there is this growing sense of vulnerability with more and more actors trying to take advantage of that sense of decline. But I think given the threats around the world, given our interests around the world, given the fact that we rely very heavily on this globalized infrastructure, we can't shrink from the world. We have to address the major issues that threaten us as well as our allies, whether it's proliferation or terrorism or pandemics and corruption. These are issues in a world where no corner of the globe can be ignored anymore that have to be addressed and in some ways require U.S. leadership still. But we can't underwrite global security. So what does that mean? Well, I think this means that we need to continue to find new models as to how we think about national and homeland security. Just as we talked about what that looks like in the homeland security context, we have to think about what this looks like internationally. We have to think about new partnerships and alliances. I talked about Southeast Asia. There are other ways of forming alliances, for example, with our Saudi brethren and Emirati brethren in the Persian Gulf, to look at the problems of Yemen and to try to contain them. There are ways of creating smarter alliances along certain fissures, for example, in East Asia, with countries like Vietnam and Indonesia worried about the rise of Chinese power. With the dragon having bared its teeth, I think, strategically too early, you have countries in the region like South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, looking to the United States to provide a counterweight. Those are opportunities. Finally, and this is something Melanie and I have talked a good bit about, is the role of the private sector. Private actors in this environment, individuals, small groups, cells, literally the cell and others, to actually be leveraged by the United States government. We spend a lot of our time and energy worrying about those actors who can do great damage geopolitically to our interests on the negative side of the ledger. We spend infinitesimally less time worrying about and thinking about how we can use this same environment that uses the internet, social networking, and the media to actually empower and help our national security. Let me give you one example, because I don't have time to give you multiple, but let me give you one example that I think will ring true to you and as well to our Israeli guests. When we thought about, both at the Treasury and when I was at the White House, how we could isolate rogue actors from the international financial system, we thought not about just classic state-based sanctions, the sanctions that we all learned about, the ones that were imposed ineffectively on South Africa or Iraq or other countries. We thought about how we could leverage the interests of the private sector to not do business with bad guys. Bankers do not want to do business, for the most part, with bad guys, and they don't want illicit capital, dirty money, flowing through their bank accounts. They don't want their names splashed on the front page of the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. And they've created compliance systems and risk assessment to actually avoid those scenarios. And so what did we do? We reconceived of how to isolate rogue individuals and actors and countries in the international financial system. And it's no secret that Iran is now hurting in a fairly dramatic way from the financial pressure that's being put on it. Part of the reason, and a large part of the reason, is that you've had an exodus of the banks that were helping Iran fund much of its activities. You have a number of the oil companies withdrawing activities because of fear of follow-on sanctions. You have insurance companies unwilling to insure shipments for Iran, for example, the Iranian shipping line, with then Iranian ships being seized in places like Singapore and Hong Kong. This is dramatic. But it's not because of what countries are doing, it's because of what the private sector has decided to do in parallel with international security interests. That's what I mean when I talk about leveraging the environment, the global international environment, in a way that is commensurate with our national security interests. Because at the end of the day, we're the good guys. And we need to remember that, and we need to leverage the international environment for those purposes. So with all that, I think we need to think about a new approach to Homeland Security. And I think in some ways you're doing it right here in this conference. You're doing it with the meetings that you've hosted. You're doing it, Melanie, as you creep across the stage here. You're doing it with all the activities of the cell. And I think we need more conferences and meetings and examples like you're setting here in Denver, because it's how we're going to protect our communities and our country in the future. Because what is global is ultimately local, and what is local ultimately has global impact. And I think that has to be at the heart of how we view Homeland Security in the 21st century. Because I think it's going to be less about guns and gates. It's going to be more about smart strategic alliances and partnerships that we build with friends and neighbors around the world, and friends and neighbors that are sitting right next to each other. So with that, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you, and I wish you well in the conference.
Wow. We have had the distinct honor of not only hosting Juan Zarate here this evening, but certainly about 2 months ago. We, as you all hopefully received, an email asking for questions in which we can pose to Juan. And he's
You're going to take the hard ones, right?
And totally. And I get to facilitate those questions. So for the next, I would say, 10 minutes, we're going to be asking some really hard questions that have come to us from all of you. So thank you. The first question that I actually want to ask you is, you talked a lot specifically about the international terrorism threat and the international security cooperation that has gone a long way with respect to this country. But can you explain how terrorist attacks in Sweden, India, Africa, and elsewhere actually impact the United States and in communities such as Denver? What gets the attention of Department of Homeland Security, and how does it impact the way local law enforcement prepares and responds to situations?
Great question. I don't think any terrorist attack can be viewed in isolation for two reasons. One, the terrorist groups that are operating, be they Sunni extremists, Shia extremists, in some ways are rogues of the international system. What they're looking to do is to terrorize the international community, whether it be in Sweden or Africa or in the United States. And so in some ways, they are part of a movement that views as legitimate the killing of innocent civilians for some purpose, some stated political purpose, and it depends on what group you're talking about. So in a sense, the delegitimation of that is incredibly important to the entire world, because to the extent that people think that it's okay or that it's morally legitimate or theologically defensible to actually attack fellow citizens or citizens of another country or people of a different religion or race, that is harmful, because that creates moral space for people to operate. And I think one of the things that CEL does well is to bring the voices of victims to the issue of terrorism, to say that there are human voices and lives impacted by this. The second reason it relates is that in many cases, not all, but in many cases, these networks interact and interrelate. Take, for example, the Africa example, the Al-Shabaab movement in Somalia, which is ideologically aligned with Al-Qaeda. They're fighting in Somalia for control of the territory. They actually control a good bit of it already. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI have been quite worried for some time because there's been a pipeline of American Somali recruits who've been recruited not just in the US and not only been radicalized, but have been mobilized to go fight in East Africa. The first instance of an American suicide bomber was actually an American Somali citizen committing an act of terror in Somalia, blowing himself up. And so the concern is with a group like Al-Shabaab, which not only is attacking in Somalia, but decided during the World Cup, if folks recall, to attack in Uganda, that it will decide to not only train Americans and Westerners, but will send them back and deploy them to hit in the Mall of America or to hit in a subway somewhere in the United States. And so what may seem to be a very isolated part of the world, and this is what I said, no corner of the world can go ignored, can have very immediate and close to home impact, especially in the 21st century, when it takes half a day to get from someplace like Yemen or Somalia to New York, Denver, or Minneapolis.
Along those lines, I mean, you mentioned, obviously, United States citizens being trained in some rogue states, such as Pakistan, Yemen, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth, and actually bringing it back to here, to the United States. One of our participants here tonight, Leslie Starks, actually asked, how serious do you see the threat of homegrown terrorism here, and how can we best prepare to combat that challenge?
It's a great question, one that's being debated certainly in communities like this, but also in counterterrorism circles in Washington and around the world. In a sense, we have thought of ourselves as relatively immune to the radicalization that Al-Qaeda has spawned. We've seen the problem in Europe quite extensively in places like London and in Denmark and the Netherlands. And in some ways, we have been immune to the wave of radicalization that we've seen. Part of it is, and I may be Pollyannish about this, but I think it's an effect of having a Cuban-American and a Mexican-American father. I believe in the American dream. And in some ways, the American dream is the counter-narrative to Al-Qaeda's narrative. Now, the problem is you've seen, over the last couple of years in particular, more Americans falling prey to this narrative that I talked about, and thinking that they now have to participate in attacks against U.S. interests. What's dangerous about what's happening and what we've seen over the last year is not only the volume, because we've seen a lot of these cases now emerge, with the FBI, I think, doing a good job of disrupting, but we've seen Americans willing to kill fellow Americans. The trend in the past had not necessarily been for Americans to view America as a battle space. People would go to fight in Pakistan, or go to fight in Somalia, or go to fight in Yemen. What you've seen, disturbingly, I think, is a tendency for people to start to view their fellow neighbors, the recruitment centers for the military in their communities, as legitimate targets. That's problematic. I would also say that you have the problem of a select group of Americans actually now forming a prominent part in the movement globally. Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni-American cleric, is a part of this group in Yemen. Samir Khan, another American, runs the media arm for the group in Yemen. Adnan Shukujuma now forms part of the core in Pakistan and is in charge of some of the external plotting for Al-Qaeda. He's an American. Omar Hamami, one of the jihadi rappers and recruiters in East Africa, is a part of the Al-Shabaab movement in Somalia, a kid from Alabama. And so, you have, unfortunately, a trend of more Americans falling prey to the narrative here, some of it via the internet and otherwise, and then some Americans actually devoting their expertise and interest to the organization abroad. And I think that's troubling. That said, I don't think we should overreact. I think there are two things we can do as a community. One, build community awareness, and that means ties into Muslim American communities, communities that may be impacted. That's not only law enforcement, but it's communities writ large, and I think that's critical. The second thing is, I think we need to counter the narrative. We need to remind people what the American dream is about. That narrative is real, and it's that narrative that actually, I think, will ultimately buttress a grand wave of youth in America from falling prey to this what I consider to be a foreign ideology.
Along those lines, one of the individuals here was talking specifically about civil liberties and that of security, and I think you just started to touch upon it. But obviously, there has been a few allegations by the Muslim leaders who believe that organizations and their religious and cult community centers have been unjustly targeted by the United States government and their surveillance tactics and counterterrorism efforts. Where do we draw the line, and have we crossed that line already?
Well, I think the question of security and civil liberties balance is a critical one, and frankly, I think it's one we should have out in the open often, because I think if there's ever a sense in American society, whether it's in American Muslim communities or otherwise, that there are things happening sub rosa that they're not aware of, and they don't understand the balance. They don't understand why certain steps are being taken. I think that's to the detriment of everybody, because I think ultimately we need citizens who are responsible and who are reacting to the threats we face. In the context of the threat we face, I think we need to be open and honest with each other. And I think the reality is that the greatest threat that we face is from this ideology that pretends to define Muslim identity in a violently exclusionary way, in a way that tries to get people to think of themselves as other, and tries to get them to actually commit acts of violence against those who aren't identified with them. And so I think communities need to be aware of that. And I think actually there's some good news coming out of that. You've seen, for example, in Minneapolis, the American Somali community going to the FBI, going to the Department of Homeland Security saying, we don't want our youth being recruited and sent to die in Somalia. This is a form of kidnapping in a sense, and it's abuse. Help us understand the dynamics. Help us weed out those who are doing this to our sons and daughters, and let us deal with this as a community. And I think at the end of the day, and this is something I've preached since I've been at the White House and now beyond, the ultimate solution to the ideological battle underway globally will come from Muslims themselves. It has to. Theologically, morally, those who profess this extreme ideology have to be isolated, and they have to be seen as extreme, and they have to be seen as enemies of humanity. And that will come in large part from credible voices within Muslim communities.
Along the lines with the White House and your experience in the White House, is there anything that you can tell us about how we avoided another major incident since 9/11? Are there policy areas that have been successful? Is there anything we can do to support the continuation of these policies? And I'm going to add to that question, which was by William Mutch from the Blanchard Group, by the way. Have there policies that have been proven ineffective and have failed?
Good question, or sets of questions. When I left the White House, I gave 3 speeches as soon as I got out, and my argument was, you're going to see fundamental continuity with our counterterrorism policies, in part because the new administration is going to see the world much the same way that we did in terms of the threats. And I think in some ways it's borne out. This isn't meant as a political statement, but I think where the administration has gotten into hot water, whether it's the trial for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or the closure day for Guantanamo, those decisions have come from political instincts versus the reality of the threats faced. And so I think there's been fundamental continuity, but there's been an evolution of our policy, and I think we have to recognize it. I think one of the things that was critical at an early stage, less important later on, was actually understanding the intelligence picture for Al-Qaeda. People forget, and I think it's to our detriment to forget this, how blind the U.S. government felt to the Al-Qaeda threat right after 9/11. I was walking the streets of Washington, D.C. People were literally looking up or looking down the street, expecting the next plane to hit or the next car bomb to go off. People had no idea what Al-Qaeda intended, no idea what the network looked like. And so the policies early on were really dictated around the effort to gather as much information and knowledge about the network as possible, and then to disrupt it, to create actionable information to disrupt. So I think our policies in terms of information gathering, disruption abroad, creating layers of defense, trying to undercut the theological, moral legitimacy of this ideology, I think all of that has largely continued in evolution. Some of it has changed, some of it's been pared back. I think where we have failed sometimes is to recognize where our actions or reactions actually feed the enemy's strategic narrative. And so, for example, how we responded to the December 25th failed attack to the enemy appeared to be a complete success. And they've noted that. For example, the group in Yemen has noted that, we tore each other apart in many ways, even though they failed. And so I describe this sometimes in the media as the terrorists somewhat understanding they can throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, and see where we're going to run next to cover our bases. And so I think that's a lesson we need to learn, and it's a lesson of resilience that, again, we need to learn from the Israelis and others, where we don't overreact, we don't overcommit, and we're rational about how we react to our enemy's actions.
And I'm going to ask you just two more questions. You mentioned and you talked a little bit about the WikiLeaks. How does the WikiLeaks events affect our anti-terrorism efforts? How serious of a threat is cyber terrorism, and is our country prepared to handle those threats? Ron Warner, Systems Security Analyst, HDR.
Great questions. Let me take the cyber defense issue first, and then the WikiLeaks issue, because the WikiLeaks issue is a little bit, it's broader in some ways. Cyber defense, I think we are getting better at creating systems that are resilient to cyber attacks, both in the government and the private sector. The challenge for the government, though, and the person who asked the question probably knows this firsthand, is 80% of the cyber infrastructure is in private sector hands. And so the government has a tendency of thinking that it controls the cyber universe when it really doesn't. And I think one of the things that White Houses of both political stripes have tried to grapple with is how do you create resilient cyber systems, digital systems, whether it's for the financial system or for critical infrastructure or just for information flow. How do you do it not just for the government, but how do you do it as a nation? And I think it goes right to the heart of what I was talking about earlier. We have to reconceptualize what it means to be secure, because in many ways our security in the cyber context will be when the private sector feels that it's secure and that it's not subject to attacks either from nation states or vulnerabilities to attacks from cyber terrorists or those who are sort of anarchists on the internet. In terms of WikiLeaks, I think there was an argument perhaps to be had. I didn't buy it, but there was an argument to be had when the leaks were about our military campaigns, that this was about protest and about legitimate transparency of wars that were deemed to be either illegitimate or unpopular. But I think this latest tranche is basically a data dump on all of our diplomatic activities around the world, and not just historical. I mean, these are current Obama administration efforts, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Iran, whether it's Middle East peace, whether it's counterproliferation, counterterrorism, work in Yemen. I mean, it's the full slate of things that we're doing on behalf of the American people, but also in terms of our interests. I think it does huge damage to our credibility. First, can the United States keep a secret? Who's going to talk to us now, candidly, not only about bilateral issues, but their impressions around the world? So Chris Hill, for example, who's now a member of the Denver community, he and I were talking about this earlier, and I said to him, it's fairly common in these diplomatic interactions to have a note taker there for the U.S. government, to take notes and to be able to report back to Washington. If I'm a foreign counterpart, there's no way I'm going to allow a note taker to be in there, at a minimum, not to mention the chilling effect on what I'm going to tell my counterpart. So that hurts. Secondly, the United States, despite whatever Julian Assange and his counterparts and compatriots like to think, actually is a force for good in the world, and is seen in these cables is actually trying to solve very hard problems behind the scenes, often quietly. And to the extent that this hurts our ability to not only gather information and to serve as that catalyst for solving these hard problems, that not only hurts the United States government, but it hurts the international community. It's precisely why Secretary Clinton said this is an attack on the international community. I agree with that. And so I think it does huge damage. And I think the last point is it is going to start and I think spark a debate in this country about how it is that people deal with information like this. I mean, we've always had a balance between press freedoms and government secrets dictated by the Constitution and certain understandings. This sort of throws that a kilter a bit, and I think it's going to start a national debate about how to deal with situations like this, which are not only damaging to our national security, but throw off that balance.
The last question that actually comes from Tracy Kesey from the Denver Police Department. How can the federal and local law enforcement work more cooperatively to help citizens understand the need to balance public safety and human rights? And I'm going to add to that, what is the role each individual plays in combating terrorism?
Well, I think the first step is just awareness building. I think people need to be aware, and this group is probably the best example. People here are aware already of the threats we face. Again, how the global affects the local, how the local affects the global. I think it's, in the 21st century, we have to have a citizenry that understands that what happens in places like Afghanistan and Yemen and Somalia, and what happens in Middle East peace affects our security in Denver and Minneapolis and Orange County, where I'm from, in California. So that's critical. It's the awareness building in the first instance. Secondly, I think citizens have to understand how they can be empowered. What opportunities are there to serve? How can they volunteer? How can they be the eyes and ears for the police force? How can they actually serve in a way that's either helpful in awareness building or in terms of response? I think there are huge opportunities for a volunteer cadre to be built in the country around these issues. Finally, I think we have to have more open debates about these balances, civil liberties and security. And the balance won't always be clear. And I think security sometimes should lose out to human rights and civil liberties. I don't think this is cut and dry. And this goes to our understanding of the risks that we face, a balancing of what those risks are, what we're willing to accept or not. This goes all to the pat-down debate for TSA. Is it worth it? Is it worth it given the nature of the threat? The calculus currently is yes. But at some point, the answer may be no. And so we've got to have those debates, and those debates happen at kitchen tables, conferences like this, with lawyers in all sorts of venues, and that actually starts from the ground up in many ways.
Great. Well, Juan, thank you very much. We are honored to have you here tonight. Your remarks were incredibly poignant. You touched on a number of different issues. We're excited to be part of the Urban Area Security Initiative Conference in the coming days and welcome all our guests from around the country and the nation. And one person I didn't recognize because I didn't think he was going to be here tonight, I thought he was going to be in Washington, D.C., was Congressman Kaufman, who actually supports a lot of initiatives between the United States and our partners with Israel. So, Congressman, thank you for coming, and thank all of you for coming. That's it.